evening. It's nice to have you all with us, and it's been an interesting week. Weather-wise, very unsettled, and I know we have quite a few of our regular people who are down at the Ligonier conference this week. So looks like we're a little lower in attendance than normal, but anyway, it's good to be here, and very much looking forward to our presentation this evening. Just by way of a couple of announcements, we have a forum coming up next month, and it will feature Dr. Richard Howes, who will be here.
A smattering of applause.
A smattering of applause.
You put my heart on
Dr.
the wrong
Melvin
side.
Fine, and many of you are familiar with Richard. Melvin Fine is a sociology professor at Kennesaw State University. A very admirable person in many respects. He's certainly been very courageous there at KSU in standing up against a lot of the PC left-wing nonsense that dominates in higher education. So I certainly have a good bit of admiration for Dr. Fine. Now, Dr. Fine is also an agnostic, and so he and Richard will be carrying on a dialogue discussion, informal debate next month on the topic, do we need God to be good? What is the source of morality? So it should be a very, very interesting exchange, and if you will, help us get the word out. That's so vitally important when those of you will help us get the word out and encourage others to join us for these forums. So we appreciate that very much. Over the last 11 years, the Areopagus has sponsored more than 250 seminars and forums on topics related to Christian apologetics and history and science and significant books and contemporary cultural issues. And of course, for more information about the Areopagus, most of you are familiar with our ministry, but if you're not, we have a literature table in the back there, so please stop by. And also, if you'd like to be on our mailing list and you're not currently on our email list, we have a sign-up sheet on the back there as well. As we usually do, following our presentation this evening, we'll have a Q&A session, so welcome relevant questions and comments, and we had a very stimulating Q&A session last night following Mr. Tooley's presentation at Mount Bethel United Methodist Church in Marietta, so hopefully it'll be equally stimulating this evening as well. Now, in our publicity for tonight's event, I wrote that for more than 200 years, American Christianity was anchored by the great historic mainline Protestant denominations, the Presbyterians, the Congregationalists, the Puritans, the Episcopalians, the Methodists, and the Lutherans. But for over a generation, mainline Protestantism has been in a state of crisis and decline as a result of two interrelated factors. First of all, the influence of theological liberalism with a corresponding departure from the historic Christian faith and a rejection of biblical values. And then secondly, the promotion of a radical left-wing social and political agenda that's alienated many church members and led to mass defections from these mainline denominations. Now, the Institute on Religion and Democracy was founded back in 1981 by a coalition of clergy and laity who are dedicated to renewing the spiritual vitality in mainline Protestant churches and restoring respect for the Bible as the ultimate authority for what we believe and what we practice. And we're very honored this evening to have with us the president of the Institute on Religion and Democracy, the IRD, Mr. Mark Tooley. And since 2009, Mr. Tooley's been the president of the IRD. And as many of you know, the IRD is essentially an ecumenical think tank and advocacy group located in Washington, D.C. Mr. Tooley's a native of Arlington, Virginia, and a graduate of Georgetown University. And prior to joining the IRD, he worked for 8 years with the Central Intelligence Agency. So, you know, if you come up and interact with Mr. Tooley after our event, you really don't have to introduce yourself or explain much, but he probably knows more about you than perhaps even your spouse. Okay? But Mr. Tooley's a lifelong Methodist and has been active in the United Methodist Renewal Movement since 1988, when he wrote a study about denominational funding of pro-Marxist groups for his local congregation. And a few years later, he joined the IRD and founded the organization's United Methodist Committee, or UM Action. He's the author of two very significant books, Taking Back the United Methodist Church, which he wrote in 2008, and Methodism and Politics in the 20th Century, which he wrote in 2012, as well as many articles that have appeared in the Wall Street Journal, American Spectator, Pathos, World Magazine, Christianity Today, National Review Online, and many other publications as well. He's also a frequent commentator on radio and television, and again, it's a great privilege to have Mr. Tooley with us this evening. So if you will, please extend a very warm welcome to Mark.
Appreciate that very much, and it's great to escape the freezing temperatures of Northern Virginia for the freezing temperatures of Atlanta. It's been a nice respite. Last evening, being in a United Methodist Church, I talked mostly about mainline Protestantism and its problems and what it can teach us, good and bad. This evening, of course, we're in for a different kind of church, more evangelical in its history and theology. Of course, the Methodist Church last night was also evangelical, from the Evangelical Wing of United Methodism, which is primarily a more liberal denomination. But here, this is evangelical territory, so I'm going to speak about evangelicalism in America and where its problems are, what its problems may be in the future, and what it can learn from the mainline Protestant history in an effort to try to avoid what happened to the mainliners. And I was overly ambitious last night. I kept talking and talking, and even then I cut short some of my text. So tonight's remarks are shorter, so we have more time for questions. So I'll hope to wrap up by time is it now? Quarter after, I would think, at the latest. Well, recently, as some of you may have read, there was a Nashville area pastor who professes to be evangelical and who was described in media accounts as evangelical, but he was making headlines by announcing that his church's acceptance of same-sex marriage and same-sex behavior and the full gamut of the LGBTQ advocacy program. There was still more media, even more recently, for a Portland, Oregon area pastor whose evangelical denomination cut off their official ties to that relatively new congregation in Portland after that pastor had announced his support for same-sex marriage and the LGBTQ affirmation agenda. Debates over same-sex marriage and homosexuality previously, and until fairly recently, were reserved for historically mainline Protestant denominations who have had that conversation now for at least 40 years or more over Christian sexual ethics, and of course having already liberalized theologically well back in the 1920s and even earlier. Those debates, of course, have fueled accelerated membership loss for them and eventual schism for most of them, who have, as I mentioned last night, the mainline Protestants, or at least the 7 major denominations that comprise them, have imploded, with 1 in 6 Americans 50 years ago belonging to those 7 denominations, and today 1 in 16 Americans belong to those 7 major mainline Protestant denominations, making them no longer really mainline, but more accurately old line or even sideline, as some will now say. But parts of American evangelicalism, which has become America's largest religious demographic in the wake of mainline collapse, accounting now for perhaps, according to some polls, 1/3 of all Americans, is now succumbing to the same theological, ethical, cultural, political patterns that marginalize the mainline Protestants. Liberal hegemony over most mainline Protestant denominations took about a century to achieve, but for some evangelicals, the same process is unfolding far, far more quickly, even before our eyes. My own organization, as has been mentioned, was founded in 1981 in the midst of the Cold War to challenge primarily the mainline Protestant denominations whose elites and agencies, not the membership, but those who were higher up, were supporting Marxist revolution globally under the aegis of what was in a popular fad called liberation theology, which manifested in moral and financial backing for Marxist insurgencies overseas, like the FALN guerrillas in El Salvador, if you remember them, back in the 70s and 80s, and for Marxist regimes like the Sandinistas in Nicaragua. Plus, on top of that, those churches officials were silent about human rights abuses and even persecution of Christians behind the Iron Curtain, instead favoring collaboration with the Soviet Union and its proxies on issues of nuclear disarmament and so forth. It was a very, very long road for the mainline Protestants, who, after all, had been literally the founders of American democracy and even free enterprise, to travel from that position to active support for totalitarianism in the name of Jesus Christ in their political witness. But that road began with theological compromises early in the 20th century, or before, when the Bible and Christian tradition were reinterpreted into metaphors, and the redemption story for lost souls was replaced by social reform under the banner of the social gospel. Mainline Protestant elites, by the 1930s, were opposed to what they called the profit motive, which was their description of capitalism, and were backing a state ownership of industry. The kingdom of God for them was reinterpreted as a politically and socially engineered utopia where poverty and justice were banished by active, ongoing state action. Of course, in the 1960s, the mainline elites were further radicalized, backing an anti-imperialist narrative that demonized America and the West while sanctifying Third World Marxist revolution and its East Bloc patrons. And as I mentioned last evening, that's what motivated me as a young man, as a college student active in my local Methodist church in Northern Virginia, to become involved in these church controversies when I discovered, to my great horror, that my denomination, among others, was through its missions dollars supporting, as mentioned, groups like the Sandinistas in Nicaragua and the Marxist guerrillas in El Salvador, which I just knew, on top of being just an affront to the gospel itself, I just knew was not supported by the vast majority of church members, who of course were unaware of what was happening with their church dollars. The founders of my organization, which included evangelical theologian Carl Henry, aggressively responded to mainline support for Marxism by declaring that the church is not primarily a political instrument, but when it does speak politically, it should side with democracy, human rights, and above all, religious freedom for all, as principles in always imperfect human governance that best accommodate the Christian view of human dignity and transcendence. The leftward drift of mainline Protestantism, typically disguised behind often vaguely phrased sermons that utilize orthodox language with often very unorthodox meanings, was largely undetected by most actual mainline Protestant churchgoers for decades, who were uninformed about the machinations of distant seminaries and church agencies operating in their name and with their unknowing financial backing. The challenge and research by my organization back before I joined the staff in the early 1980s, after 1994, but these early research and exposés led to major reporting on church support for Marxism by, for example, 60 Minutes, which did a major story in 1983, and there were several articles in Reader's Digest magazine, which used to be read by everybody, and now has been largely forgotten, of course, but I think most of you probably recall the Reader's Digest days. And much of that reporting focused on groups like the National World Council of Churches, which were essentially creations of mainline Protestantism and had been, in their day, formidable and prestigious and influential organizations. In many ways, mainline Protestantism, and especially its ecumenical expressions in those church councils, never fully recovered their public image for probity and as pillars of American spirituality and culture, which they had remarkably sustained for 350 years, literally dating back to Jamestown and Plymouth Rock. But even more importantly, theological liberalism, which rejected or minimized the supernatural, personal redemption, and the afterlife, negating the evangelistic imperative, had nullified, neutralized the mainline's ability to gain new adherents. Hence a half-century of continuous membership decline, for which there is still no end in sight for them. During this mainline self-destruction, evangelicals quietly but steadily grew in numbers, filling the void left behind by the mainline retreat, and elevated by, among others, by Billy Graham revivals, the founding of Christianity Today magazine, the increasing stature of evangelical colleges and seminaries, and by an explosion in entrepreneurial parachurch ministries, especially in campus ministries on many secular college campuses, many of which, of course, were previously mainline Protestant institutions, but had long since stepped away from any meaningful Christian identification. Evangelicals subsequently captured 2 generations of spiritually seeking young people, while the mainline failed to successfully retain any generation, really, after the World War II cohort. Evangelical denominations, including even Pentecostals, who previously were viewed as socially marginal, grew exponentially, with the Pentecostal Assemblies of God enjoying 500% growth over the last 50 years, surpassing the once culturally unassailable Episcopal Church, the most prestigious of mainline denominations, and now outnumbering the Episcopalians by over 50%, a gap that almost certainly will continue to grow. Evangelicals in America have typically never been, in large numbers, separationist or Anabaptist in how they view society, and were nearly always engaged good citizens and voters. Their voting patterns actually not very different from mainline Protestants over the decades. But mainline implosion facilitated the collapse of American moral consensus starting in the 1960s, creating essentially 40 years of culture war and polarization. Evangelicals began to politically organize as evangelicals through what came to be known as the religious right in the mid and late 1970s, and they, of course, were motivated and disturbed over secularization, abortion, radical feminism, pornography, and America's receding place in the world as the Cold War seemed to tilt towards the Soviet Union. Backed by a growing subculture of large suburban congregations, Christian radio stations, television ministries, and intersecting parachurch groups that were both spiritual and political, the founders of the religious right, embodied by people like Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson, helped lead formerly Democratic Southern voters into Ronald Reagan's coalition in 1980. The moral majority was seen as the religious right's primary voice in the late 1970s and 1980s, succeeded by the Christian coalition in the 1990s, sometimes supplemented by advocacy or pronouncements from James Dobson's Focus on the Family, among other groups and individuals. This generation of religious right leadership was certainly bold, unashamed, outspoken, polemical, combative, anxious for political and spiritual trench warfare, truly distressed over the country's direction and shaped by decades of their own struggle on the cultural and political margins, where conservative evangelicals were treated dismissively by an American society whose elites were liberal and, to the extent they were religious at all, were very often mainline Protestant. Liberal critics of evangelical activism through the religious right in the 1980s claimed that they were fueling the Reagan administration's confrontation with the Soviet Union and perhaps even hoping to precipitate a final apocalypse that would usher in Jesus Christ's return. The Cold War's end and Bill Clinton's electoral victories forestalled much of that panicked secular and liberal reaction to conservative evangelical political advocacy in those days. But Clinton's personal scandals and advocacy of abortion rights and gay causes further provoked evangelical indignation and political organizing throughout the late 1990s, and their power continued despite the receding, at least institutionally, of groups like the Moral Majority and the Christian Coalition as the new century approached. Conservative evangelicals enthusiastically backed George W. Bush in 2000, encouraged by Bush's own Christian testimony and personal faith devotion, although Bush, of course, remained a mainline Protestant himself, being a United Methodist. But it was the 2004 Bush re-election that most alarmed liberal and secular critics, who despised Bush and did not anticipate his victory, which was facilitated by nearly 80% support from white evangelicals who comprised nearly a quarter of the electorate. A dark new narrative was alleged in which Evangelical Republican Alliance would promulgate Christian theocracy in America, where supposedly women and gays were oppressed along with all non-Christians, and which would pursue imperialist wars of conquest and crusade around the world starting, of course, with Afghanistan and Iraq, continuing on and on. The 2004 election results motivated some leftist philanthropies to take evangelicals seriously and to fund alternative evangelical political initiatives that would pull evangelicals in more liberal directions. George Soros, for example, began funding Jim Wallace's Sojourners organization at that time, as did other outreaches and creations of new liberal evangelical groups espousing liberal perspectives on immigration, the environment, enhanced interrogation and torture, nuclear weapons, drones, among many other issues over the last 8-9 years. These new efforts to inflate an active and prominent and effective evangelical left arose as many central institutions of evangelicalism were already internally liberalizing morally and theologically. Partly this trend was sociologically inevitable, similar to mainline Protestant schools and institutions liberalizing in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, wanting freedom and independence for themselves, and resenting somewhat being under the authority of church organizations and officials. Partly it was a psychological reaction against the religious right by a new generation of baby boomer evangelical elites who, unlike the silent generation religious right founders like Falwell and Robertson and Dobson, did not have to fight to gain social legitimacy, were not as much shaped by the Cold War, were less confrontational and more therapeutic in style, and were more anxious for cordial relations with liberal and secular critics. Some evangelical academics especially chafed at identification with the Bush administration and were anxious for a new public and especially political identity. Naturally, these baby boomer academics began to influence their students, who were increasingly millennials. The newly emboldened, funded, and confident evangelical left was enthusiastic for Barack Obama, who was himself a liberal Protestant, represented ostensibly a post-ideological and post-racial America, would focus on social uplift at home rather than wars abroad, and whose election would, it was hoped, atone for America's past racial sins. But in fact, white evangelicals as a whole voted for John McCain in 2008 at nearly the same rate they had supported George W. Bush in 2004, although McCain had no similar evangelical testimony or interest in evangelical issues, but illustrating that evangelicals remained steadfastly conservative politically, no matter the candidate at the time. But interestingly, about 1/3 of young evangelicals did vote for Barack Obama in 2008, giving hope to the evangelical left and its liberal allies that evangelicals would not remain a political monolith. As right and left over the last 20 years or so have contended for evangelicals with much media attention, mainline Protestants have become almost politically irrelevant, although polls show that still about 20% of Americans broadly identify with that tradition. Mainliners were never really a political voting bloc as evangelicals are thought of today. Historically, they have been more Republican than Democrat, since they are almost all entirely white, middle or upper middle class, and mostly live in the suburbs and small towns of America. Radical mainline elites never spoke for their own constituency. Church-going mainliners were, and still are, mostly Republican, much more so than nominal mainliners. Mainliners remain mostly conservative today on economics and foreign policy, still at odds very much with their much further to the left church hierarchies, but increasingly liberal on social issues, perhaps influenced more by the surrounding secular culture than by their own denominational policies, about which they still remain mostly oblivious. Meanwhile, evangelical liberals, as they have increasingly replicated the mainline Protestant experience, seem oblivious or indifferent to mainline implosion and its underlying causes. The evangelical left has become increasingly bold in departing from evangelical and Christian orthodoxy on sexual issues. Obama's endorsement of same-sex marriage effectively gave permission or provided retroactive political cover for some professing to be evangelical to follow suit. So, of course, Jim Wallace of Sojourners did so. Popular blogger Rachel Held Evans has done so. Evangelicals for Social Action, a 40-year-old liberal group that has long been pacifist and statist, but also pro-life and pro-marriage, has embraced LGBTQ advocacy under its new leadership. Other older evangelicals, on the liberal side, like, for example, Tony Campolo, have often walked up to the line on sexual issues, but not crossing that line, not wanting to lose ties to the evangelical mainstream, but still nodding their way to the liberationist narrative that LGBTQ is the next natural step for civil rights progression. More commonly, there is a growing strata of evangelical elites and activists who avoid marriage and hot-button issues like it as unnecessarily contentious in favor of focusing on more feel-good advocacy, for example, and very worthy causes, such as helping and reaching out to victims of sex trafficking, or environmentalism, or lobbying for illegal immigrants, or further exertions on behalf of the poor. One example is the annual Justice Conference, endorsed by major evangelical schools and parachurch groups, and it embodies this trend. Although it's focused on Christian social justice and appeals to evangelicals, it carefully avoids debates or even mention of marriage and protecting the unborn, as well as even the plight of persecuted Christians around the world. All of those issues are associated with the traditional religious right, and therefore are to be avoided in pursuit of a new public identity for evangelicals that is perceived as more collegial with liberalism and secular culture. Nearly every minor blip and bump by anyone who's ever been evangelical who announces for the LGBTQ cause will be widely advertised as supposed proof of historical inevitability for that cause. But, fairly remarkably, polls still show evangelicals fairly unified for traditional Christian teaching, or certainly more so than any other Christian demographic, Catholic or Protestant. Likely evangelicals will remain so, even as they fall mostly silent politically on the marriage issue as the courts essentially snatch marriage definition away from the democratic process. Interestingly, evangelicals in their personal views, including among the young, are as pro-life as ever, in some cases more so, but a significant number of evangelical elites prefer to avoid the topic or to emphasize ministries or government social programs that they think might reduce abortion rates, rather than discuss what are viewed as punitive laws restricting abortion. Avoidance or downplaying persecution of Christians globally by many evangelicals is another notable development of recent years, especially in light of recent atrocities by ISIS against Syrian, Iraqi, and Egyptian Christians. Some evangelical elites, especially among the young, see focus on Christians specifically or exclusively as self-serving and prefer a wider generic advocacy on behalf of all persecuted persons everywhere. Other notable political trends aligned with the evangelical left include a growing assumption or preference for forms of pacifism or neo-pacifism, opposition to American patriotism, which they regard as a form of nationalist idolatry, and increasing hostility or at best ambivalence about Israel and American support for it. These issues are interrelated and are together often influenced by neo-Anabaptist thinking and maybe, I think, unconscious Marcionite tendencies that minimize the Jewish scriptures. Of course, most of you will recall the Marcionite heresy from the early church denied the authority or the binding nature of the Hebrew scriptures upon Christians. The pacifism among evangelical elites and young people owes partly to the school of John Howard Yoder and Stanley Hauerwas. And you'll recall that John Yoder was a Mennonite thinker from the 50s up until his death in the 90s, and wrote a best-selling book called The Politics of Jesus in the 1970s, which are essentially reinterpreted Christianity to mean primarily the rejection of all violence, that Christ's act upon the cross was not so much about atonement for forgiveness of sins, but the rejection of all violence, that all Christians were bound to follow his example. And of course, Stanley Hauerwas, still at Duke University, is his primary disciple of the day, although even he is now getting up in years, and so there's another generation behind him. And so much of that pacifism that's been promulgated by the followers of Yoder and Hauerwas has been influential in and of itself, but another factor has been widespread anxiety over inconclusive U.S. military actions in Afghanistan and Iraq, which evangelicals are perceived to have championed. Some of the anxiety is just due to traditional post-Vietnam War rhetoric, long touted by older activists like Jim Wallace or Ron Sider, who founded and headed Evangelicals for Social Action, both of whom literally dated back to the anti-Vietnam War protest years, 40 and 45 years ago. And some of this anxiety is partly an understandable desire for Christians to focus on reconciliation over conflict. But this pacifism, which is typically not based on traditional Anabaptist Mennonite beliefs that affirm the state's vocation for violence, but also affirm that some communities of Christians are called to non-participation in government. This new form of pacifism is very often absolutist and demands that the government itself renounce all violence, or at least demands that all Christians who are truly Christian renounce any participation in the state's violence, whether that's military or even law enforcement. Shane Claiborne, the Philadelphia activist who was literally in Iraq in 2003 when the U.S. bombs began to fall, to stand in solidarity, as he perceived it, with Iraq against U.S. aggression, and who recently, last week, as I saw, tweeted that he hoped that both ISIS and U.S. police departments would both reject their abuses, almost sort of equating the two, is a prominent and no doubt sincere pacifist advocate who appeals to some younger evangelicals. One of his slogans has been "More ice cream, fewer bombs," in an initiative that was funded appropriately by Ben & Jerry's ice cream. This pacifism among some evangelicals is also typically anti-American, with much critique of quote-unquote empire that compares America to ancient Rome, or perhaps even worse, the Third Reich. It does not often, if at all, concern itself with the violence of truly tyrannical regimes that truly are empires that are hostile to America. The pacifist absolutism inspired by the school of John Yoder and Stanley Hauerwas and Jim Wallace and Shane Claiborne, which portrays any agents of violence, whether soldiers or police, as in effect anti-God, is of course a stark rejection of classical Christian teaching rooted in the New Testament about God's vocation for the state to wield the sword to avenge evil. Their perspective assumes that across history and cultures, almost all of Christianity has been in error on this issue, and only a select prophetic few have been aligned with God's perspective. And except for occasional reluctant admissions from, for example, Stanley Hauerwas, who recently on the radio when pressed said that he would allow his own family to be slaughtered before he would physically intervene if he remained a faithful Christian, their exponents do not admit the consequences of their advocacy, and as such offer what is essentially a utopian and not Christian, much less evangelical, view of the world. The evangelical rejection of American patriotism, which stereotypes the religious right as handmaidens to American empire, also slips into this utopianism by asserting that Christians are to have no national loyalties or presumably ties to any community other than the church itself, in effect asking Christians to behave almost as disembodied spirits without any earthly ties, despite a traditional Christian perspective that God appoints the nations and that Christians are to serve the communities where God has placed them. This perspective almost always accepts and repeats as Christian truth a post-1960s New Left critique of American foreign policy that fantasizes, as for example does Shane Claiborne's 2004 book called Jesus for President, that nearly all evils in the world were born in America. And this perspective, of course, ignores the wars, barbarisms, and genocides of Hitler, Stalin, Mao, Pol Pot, Saddam Hussein, and countless others whose tens of millions of victims apparently don't register for them. Demonizing America is closely related to the anti-Israel animus of the new evangelical left. Israel is often seen as an extension of the American empire and therefore merits resistance. There is also acceptance of liberation theology's narrative that Christians are called to automatic solidarity with perceived oppressed third world persons against wealthy Western imperialists, with Israel, of course, in the latter role and the Palestinians in the first role, while ignoring the wider history and geostrategic circumstances. All religious right enthusiasm for Israel, often perceived to be motivated by end times dispensationalist scenarios, is to be countered with an even more zealous activism for liberation, regardless of the consequences. Of course, many evangelicals prefer what they are calling a, quote, pro-Israel, pro-Palestine, pro-peace stance that is ostensibly impartial, but its goals and consequences, an end to evangelical and American alliance with Israel, are hardly impartial. Yet many well-intentioned, especially missions-minded evangelicals, often funded by large and prestigious groups like World Vision, or hosted by groups like Telos, located outside Washington, D.C., are escorted on biased Mideast trips, or hosted at slanted conferences that portray Israel and not other obvious actors in the Middle East as the primary regional villain and persecutor of Christians in that area. Evangelical exertions eerily resemble the mainline Protestant tours that escorted U.S. church people to propaganda visits to the Sandinistas, Nicaragua, in the 1980s, where they were solemnly instructed that the Reagan administration's aggression and not Marxist dictatorship was the primary threat to the Nicaraguan people. The utopian vision of the world offered by a new generation of evangelicals, who professed to base their policies on what Jesus would do, also resembled the mainline Protestants who cheerfully visited Bolshevik Russia in the 1920s, confident they were seeing the future as God had ordained it. After all, didn't Jesus favor a classless society? Nearly all of the troubling emphases of this new form of evangelical activism, which invariably defaults to the political left, are rooted in deep theological error. Primarily an assumption, again like the early years of liberalizing mainline Protestantism, that the world and its peoples are essentially good, but tormented by corrupt and often wicked systems, like imperialism, capitalism, environmental degradation, greed, nationalism, or even Christian Zionism and homophobia, from which liberation is urgently needed. The new evangelical activism rejects or minimizes that people as individuals are sinners needing personal redemption that is uniquely available through Jesus Christ, a message that has always been, is now, and will always be the most important, most controversial, most appreciated, and also most resisted message in the world. Much of the current evangelical reaction against old-style conservative evangelical witness asserts that the world rejected both America and Christianity because of Bush-era policies and wars that idolatrously nationalistic evangelicals unwisely supported in the name of their faith. But Christianity, like its founder, who of course was murdered for his message, will always be hated and resisted by many. No amount of strategic messaging can avert the scandal of the gospel. As to American prestige and popularity in the world, opinion polls don't always accurately measure influence and success, and great powers, to retain their power, must often inspire more fear than love. The vocation of the state, American or otherwise, is not the vocation of the church, which evangelicals too often forget or decline to understand. There is also in this new form of evangelical social witness a postmodern cognitive dissonance, which imagines that a government may simultaneously be disarmed and become pacifist, ensure peace in the world, feed and clothe everybody everywhere at all times, regulate the environment, eliminate crime, collect ever higher taxes, while never resorting to force or coercion, relying on goodwill by all. Such a society will exist in heaven, but not in any temporal society this side of the eschaton. The patience and perseverance required to work for incremental and approximate justice in this world, while accepting that no society will reach social perfection until Christ presides directly, is increasingly alien to the new form of evangelical activism. It is increasingly revealing itself in the sexual liberalism emerging on the fringes of evangelicalism, which accepts the postmodern and Gnostic assertion that individuals can escape physical reality and the communal needs of marriage and family by claiming ever more exotic sexual and gender identities, with all disapproval to be suppressed even by the coercive hand of the state, despite its supposed purpose of being pacifist. Evangelicals who veer in this utopian direction, of course, have, by definition, left evangelical and Orthodox Christian belief. They have become liberal Protestants, essentially like Episcopalians, but lacking their liturgy and good taste. Much of this emerging problem is self-correcting, as with mainline Protestants, liberalizing post-evangelicals, as they leave Orthodox Christian teaching, will lose their evangelistic zeal and their audience. Despite their egalitarian rhetoric, they will become elitist, with less and less capacity for large market share or ability to speak to regular people. Mainline Protestants have declined for decades, yet survived, however diminished, because they had 350 years of history and often generous endowments, with extensive networks of church agencies and schools. Evangelicalism is mostly a modern American phenomenon, and for better or worse, lacks the ballast of the mainline Protestants. Liberal post-evangelicals likely will not endure for many decades, unlike liberal Presbyterians and Congregationalists. But before their demise, liberalizing egalitarian post-evangelicals may wreak a lot of damage in the church, mislead a lot of people, inflict spiritual harm, and portray a disfigured face of Christianity to the world, far more erroneous than any of the mistakes of old-style, rambunctious, conservative evangelicals whom they have so harshly critiqued. For this reason, we are all called to avoid the passivity and silence of Orthodox mainline Protestants 80 and 90 years ago, who were mostly too polite to resist the subversion of their venerable church institutions and traditions. The sad mainline Protestant trajectory has already evinced the fruits of compromised Christian witness. So let's work hard to protect American evangelicalism, even its fringes, from a similar fate. So there I conclude, and I will take your questions or comments if you have any. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This is one of my important props here. Mark, would you care for?
Yes, thank you.
There we go. Straight from the trunk of my car, so nice and cold. We are, my name is Bruce Phillips. It falls to me to sort of run the Q&A session, if you will permit me. We always make the point up front that we are a 501c3 organization, which technically means not-for-profit, and we strive mightily to be not for loss. So if you would be so kind as to, if you feel so moved, to contribute to us. We have a funny sort of situation. We've got 3 rows that go across and some that don't, but I think we can get through with one. If I could start this with you and just pass this to the row behind you and pass it to, that would be great. I would appreciate it. The other thing I'd like to say is that when we do these Q&A sessions, it's very important that everyone in here can hear the questions. I think it's great. It's always difficult when questions are sort of garbled and we can't hear them from the back row, and then the poor speaker has to try to mirror what's been going on. So if you would let me know you'd like to ask a question, I'll bring the microphone to you. And if you get that back to me, then I'll be ready to pick up the next person as well. And normally I say no one likes to ask the first question, so we'll go right to the second question. But we have someone who wants to ask the first question. So that's fantastic. So let's start over here.
My name is Judy Quigley. Recently in an adjoining county, we have had a church called North Point open a brand new facility. This is an entire building, a huge building. Their first Sunday, they attracted 6,000 people. We have another group, 12 Stone Church. They opened 5 new facilities, filled them all the same Sunday. Would you address what's happening? These are claiming to be non-denominational. One leans Baptist, maybe both of them do, but they never say that. And I'm sure this is happening everywhere, but their explosion and the number of interested people that are going to these. Would you address that, please?
Well, I addressed it a little bit last evening, but supposedly we live in an age of receding religiosity, but I think the reality is much more complicated, in that we often overestimate how pious America was in the past, and we underestimate the level of religiosity in the present. And again, as I mentioned last evening, if you believe the Gallup poll says since the early 1930s, the number of Americans who say they go to church regularly has remained essentially the same at 40% for the last 80 years. So if that's even close to being true, even though you have this enormous implosion by the historic denominations, you still have lots of people who are going to church or worshiping somehow. And obviously, as you mentioned, many of them are going to these non-denominational new churches. And many people say that we're now in we're in a post-denominational age in America. That even the once growing evangelical denominations are at this point at a stall, with a few exceptions, like the Assemblies of God or the Christian Missionary Alliance. But for example, the Southern Baptists surpassed the United Methodists 45 years ago, and then became double their size. But their membership has been stalled now for the last 5, 6, 7 years, essentially flat or losing a little bit. But the growth seems to be primarily in non-denominational churches. And so it's a blessing. We can be grateful to their ministry. A concern that I would raise, of course, there are concerns about any form of Christianity. There are always pluses and minuses wherever you have people gathering together. But can the non-denominational churches, often built around the talents and the charisma of a particular pastor, can they be sustained once that pastor is gone? And when they have issues, can they deal with those issues, whether sexual scandal or financial issues, without a wider denominational structure? Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. But meanwhile, if the denominations are unable to grow, then we should be grateful for what the non-denominations are doing. And as you mentioned, many of the mega churches that are in fact still denominational, they often disguise or hide that fact. So famously, Rick Warren's church, Saddleback Church, never talks about being Southern Baptist, and that's very, very common, including even successful evangelical United Methodist congregations often disguise what they are. They're just such and such church. So interesting trend. I've mentioned last night, I've written much about the fact that Washington, D.C. is going through a season of church vitality in the city. Dozens of new church plants that appeal primarily to young adults in their 20s and 30s. Many of them non-denominational, some of them Anglican, some of them Presbyterian Church in America, some of them of Assemblies of God, all having been founded over the last decade or even the last several years. Almost none of them having their own buildings, so unless you know they're there, you don't know they're there because they're renting space typically from older established mainline denominations who no longer have congregations, but they have beautiful sanctuaries. So that's a wonderful occurrence happening in Washington, D.C. I think it's true to some extent in New York City and in Chicago and many other great cities as well.
Here we go.
When I go to a worship service, I think I would be probably offended if even a small portion of the worship time was devoted to political issues, whether it be gay and lesbian or other kinds of things. And I think there's probably a lot of people like me that believe the Bible is true. And so if we're going to talk about the gay and lesbian, we'll say, maybe not even mention them, but maybe bring up what the Bible says about homosexuality or something like that. But it doesn't seem like it's an emphasis in a lot of churches, and so I'd like for you to speak to, I think it's a good portion of us that really don't want to hear the politics thing in our worship service, and so we're sort of oblivious of it. And I'm just interested in your thoughts there.
Well, I think especially after the 2004 election and the decisive role that evangelicals played in it, there was a stereotype established in the media and elsewhere that evangelical churches, especially the mega churches, were political machines, were strong-armed clergy, were telling their congregations how to vote. But there was a survey conducted maybe by Pew several years after the fact of the amount of time that evangelical pastors devoted to political messaging, and it was very, very minimal, almost non-existent. So it turned out it was very unusual for evangelical clergy to be bringing up politics in the pulpit. If that was true 10 years ago, it's probably even less. It's probably even more true today. So I think it's unusual to find clergy who are addressing politics in the pulpit. It's even mostly true as politicized and liberal as the mainline Protestants are. It's very rare to find a pastor who wants to risk controversy in his congregation by saying something explicitly political in the pulpit, which I think is, whatever their intentions or motivations are, I think is, as you say, mostly good, that the pulpit's focus should be on proclamation of the gospel, but in some format, the church needs to teach the church's historic ethical teachings on issues like marriage and the sanctity of all human life, whether that's printed materials or Sunday school classes or a sermon topic devoted to it. It doesn't necessarily have to be related directly to electoral politics, but just to lay out the basic principles, because too many Christians, even in very Bible-oriented churches, don't have the basics of Christian teachings on a lot of ethical issues. Yes?
I was just going to say, I think in like Jeffersonian times, it would have probably been a little easier to partition the church and society on Sundays. Having the conversations that I do often with secularists, they often say, well, what I don't like is Christianity getting involved in politics. And my response is, well, what in American life isn't political now? You're defining gender, you're defining who and what arrangements in marriage can be done. Nature abhors a vacuum. And the philosophy that guides government is going to be influenced by somebody, whether it's a Christian worldview, a merely secular worldview. I would be interested to hear your points on how you think this larger cultural milieu has shaped the way the church preaches the gospel. Because I often hear in the evangelical church a very, very, very increasingly narrow communication that doesn't look at Christianity as a total system of belief, for how we conduct our ethics, for how we shape policy. What's your thoughts on how it's shaping the way in which the church preaches and proclaims the message?
Sir, we'll get to you as the next question, but let me answer this one first, and maybe you get the microphone. Well, I think I understand your point in that you believe increasingly evangelical churches are just focusing on faith and faith alone without the wider applications. Is that an accurate...
Yeah, a classic kind of Nancy Pearcey, view of total truth versus it speaking just to...
Right, there's no wider worldview presented. I think you're accurate, and partly that's an attempt, I believe, by many to avoid controversy and contentious debate. And once again, it's, as I mentioned, I believe partly psychological, this view that the old style conservative evangelicals of 20 and 30 years ago had just been so confrontational and outspoken that according to the mythology, they scared people away from Christianity. If we can just tone it down and avoid the controversial issues, that will give us wider evangelistic opportunities. And I see the point, and in some cases, I think it's arguable that, for example, Tim Keller, a very successful PCA pastor in New York City of Redeemer Church, have been very effective in reaching especially young adults in New York City, and he's obviously a popular writer in and of himself across the country, and he's thoroughly orthodox, of course, but he himself admits that almost rarely does he mention sexual issues in the pulpit. He knows he's speaking to a liberal Manhattan audience. If he's asked what he thinks about same-sex marriage or homosexuality, he will give a thoroughly biblical and orthodox answer, but he doesn't advertise it. I suppose that's defensible. The comparison that often I make as a Methodist is essentially the founding bishop of Methodism in America was Francis Asbury, who, like John Wesley, was very anti-slavery, but he realized after a certain point, if he kept talking about anti-slavery, he was going to lose access to the South, white and black audiences, and he essentially decided he was going to stop talking about it so at least he could travel south and save souls. That was a strategic decision on his part. You can debate it both ways. I understand that perspective, but I think it's unfair to say that somehow an earlier generation scared off people away from Christianity because they were polemical, controversial. In fact, much of that generation was far more successful evangelistically than we are currently. And I think the point can be made that controversy scares people, it can deter people, but it also gets people's attention, it can attract them. The gospel in and of itself is intrinsically controversial, and that can't be avoided. Yes, sir?
Yeah. Just if I may just 1 second, I remember Tim Keller saying, that when not only does he not talk about his sexual issues from the pulpit, but when he talks about heaven and hell, they stay after and have a question and answer session, because the people he's talking to have never heard these concepts. So he's dealing with a level where to get to the more sophisticated and complex ones, which are so intertwined with our culture, he's oftentimes going back to some very, very basic, and he preaches it right down the middle, which is great, but they need to stop and talk about that because people don't have that background at all. So I just thought I'd mention that.
Interesting.
Put it up front.
My name is William Wang, and I'm a retired physician. And my interest has been to illustrate the apologetic faith by means of molecular biology. So my question first is there any evangelical denomination that more emphasizes on apologetic faith on a scientific basis? That's the first question. The second question is there any molecular biologists that have the same interest in discussing the problem of illustrating the apologetic faith from the perspective of molecular biology?
I don't have the expertise to fully answer your questions. I'm not familiar with any denomination that makes that a priority. I'm sure there are individuals in the Presbyterian Church in America or in Southern Baptist Convention, academics who make that their interest. I'm not aware of any organized or programmatic focus in any denomination that makes that their primary objective. But your other question, I could suggest, you're familiar with the Discovery Institute. They would be able to answer that question better than I. A friend of mine named Jay Richards writes on these topics. He has a new online publication called The Stream, which you can look up, and I'm sure you can contact him directly and get contacts and insights for him, for example. But it's a very important question.
You mentioned the 7 mainline Protestant churches. Which ones are they?
Well, I named them last night, so let me see if I can recall them again. United Methodist is the largest, Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, the Presbyterian Church USA, the Episcopal Church, the United Church of Christ, the American Baptist, and the Christian Church, Disciples of Christ. 7.
Really? Okay.
7 sisters are called.
Okay. Who is the current Jerry Falwells of today?
Well, that's another issue, that you had these large personalities who were essentially the founding fathers of conservative evangelical activism in the 1970s. And as they have faded away, literally passed from the scene or have mostly retired, there really are no replacement large figures who have that same public role. And that's also an issue. Some people will say, well, that's good. There are no targets like there were in the figures of Falwell or Pat Robertson, who's still with us, of course, or James Kennedy, or people of that generation. But it's very hard to think of a major conservative evangelical clergyman who's politically outspoken on that same level. Yes, but I don't think at the same level. He's been outspoken the last few months on a couple of issues related to Islam, but he's not out there full throttle addressing those issues or organizing politically.
Mark, we're back here in the back.
In recent times, I've been encountering a lot of fellow believers who have kind of responded to the theonomist point of view of the past 20 or so years with a kind of Christian libertarianism, where we allow the government to be secular and we kind of exit that arena in areas of, let sinners sin and we don't involve ourselves. Can the church, in your opinion, abdicate or abandon the homosexual marriage political agenda?
Challenge to traditional Christians in that we have to explain the traditional teachings of Christianity, which are not just about private faith or personal devotion, but which speak to the whole of society, including government. And so Christianity, at least to my knowledge, most of the last 1,500 years, to the extent that it's had political influence, has taught that the state has a divine vocation to facilitate a good society and Christians typically have argued that marriage between man and woman and sustaining family life is a positive good for all people, not just for Christians, and it's a gift from God. It's an act of mercy and grace, and it protects especially children and the poor and the most vulnerable. And when family and marriage begin to collapse, the people who are harmed the most are the most vulnerable people. So you don't have to have scriptural arguments to make your case. There's pragmatic and, of course, natural law arguments. And the point you make, obviously, is even beyond those arguments, just for the self-defense of the church. Of course, if you keep ceding ground and surrendering or losing on that issue, of course, there's going to be more and more pressure, legally, coercive pressure on the church to accommodate the new sexual zeitgeist, which will not, of course, will not just stop at same-sex marriage. It obviously will include polygamy and polyamory, and it's very hard to argue against incest among consenting adults. So all kinds of ongoing arrangements which could be the government could be used to impose upon the church or other private actors. So I don't think there's any way to run away from that debate. It's going to be there. It's going to accelerate if you don't address it. And I don't think some people think or hope same-sex marriage will be put to bed. The Supreme Court is going to discover a right to same-sex marriage later this year, like they discovered a right to abortion 42 years ago. But here we are 42 years later, we're still debating abortion more than ever. So I don't think the issue is going to go away in our lifetimes.
Mark, we're back here in the back.
What, in your opinion, is the significance, if any, of some of the members of the religious right who went on to repudiate the role of political to, quote, save America? I'm thinking of Cal Thomas and Ed Dobson, and they're blinded by might. And then people, I don't know if he's in the same ilk, but people like Gregory Boyd, who identifies ostensibly as an evangelical, but he's written directly about sort of anti-political involvement. So do you think these guys, how do they fit into this scenario as you painted it tonight, if at all? And what do you think about their arguments, if you got time?
Well, I think some people who were very involved in intense political activism back in the 1980s, people like Cal Thomas, who were close to Jerry Falwell, and any force or movement up close is, of course, has all the problems associated with humanity, and the egos and the vanities and so forth. And so obviously you can come away from that. If you start out very idealistic and unrealistic, you can come away from that experience very discouraged and despairing, wanting to have no more to do with it. And also there may have been a heightened expectation of somehow we're going to save America in the next 5 years, 10 years. If you elect Ronald Reagan twice, that will do it. Obviously that didn't happen, and I think that that was, even though it was conservative evangelicals, biblically minded, who sometimes succumbed to that perspective, they were losing sight of their own tradition and teachings, in that if you're an Orthodox Christian, you believe in, especially if you're Protestant, you believe in the total depravity of mankind. By definition, your expectations are very minimal of what humanity is going to be able to accomplish. And certainly in politics, it's more a matter of preventing the worst as opposed to trying to establish the ideal society. So I think it was just a very human people like Cal Thomas who got discouraged and stepped away from the process. He certainly remained politically conservative and engaged, but more wary of the ability of organized religious activism to change society politically. And then Greg Boyd, of course, essentially went from being sort of a mainstream conservative traditional evangelical to being sort of a neo-Anabaptist separationist, very much in the tradition of those whom I mentioned, Stanley Hauerwas, John Howard Yoder. Our faith doesn't really have much to say about the state, except that we're against violence, we're against war. That's not the way of Jesus. But they're not consistent in that they want the government to do lots of things in terms of helping the poor and protecting the environment. And it's never quite clear, well, to do that, the government has to cut taxes, which means ultimately you need men with guns who have the ability to enforce the government's will, to collect those taxes and impose its will. It's a very sort of, I think, inconsistent ethic. But if you're postmodern, you don't have to worry about being consistent, of course. It's just very emotive.
I'm headed down the back here.
You've heard recently the sort of infamous Rob Bell, who at least I think claims to be an evangelical, appeared on Oprah and stated that, the Bible was irrelevant to same-sex marriage and the like. And it seems like more and more evangelicals are being co-opted by this liberal media. And I was wondering if you could have any comments on that.
Yes, of course, most of you are familiar with Rob Bell, whose church was in Grand Rapids, Michigan. So he was a prominent pastor and thinker, writer, and successful, but theologically moved more and more away from orthodoxy. And as we learned later, he essentially apparently was forced out by his congregation, who felt that he had moved too far. And of course, he reestablished himself in California, where he seems to have a wonderful beach house and spends his time surfing, and has no longer goes to a church, but has wonderful spiritual experiences with his wife and his friends, and of course is aligned with Oprah Winfrey and is speaking to her, become a motivational speaker. So interesting career trajectory, and in many ways it's very American to sort of go through that trajectory. I'm sure there were many preachers in the 19th century who moved from being traditional preachers to whatever, selling snake oil or what have you out on the circuit. So there's nothing new in that phenomenon, and in a way it's almost a tribute to the success of evangelicalism. It's become so large that you have people now peeling away at the edges, rebelling against its success and its influence, and heading off in a different direction, which would not have been the case when evangelicalism was still struggling and growing 50 years ago.
We have one here in the center.
It would appear in many ways that we're losing the moral battle, if you will, and that if we do try to speak up, then we're going to drive away evangelical opportunities, we're going to be condemned, we're mean-spirited and all this sort of thing. What should the church do? Should we speak up or lay low, or what should we do?
Well, we have to be careful, or at least decide in our own minds what we mean when we say the church. I think it's traditional Christian teaching to say that it's not the primary vocation of the institutional church, meaning of the clergy or the agencies or the actual body of the meeting house to make routine political statements about specifics of policy. But the institutional church, if it's doing its job of evangelizing and discipling and training people in the faith, will motivate and inspire some of its members to become involved in politics and to apply the faith to the political sphere and to speak out on these issues. So it's not fair to expect, sometimes we speak, well, Christians need to do this and Christians need to do that, as though all 2.5 billion Christians must act in sync and be doing all the same things all the time. And naturally, the body of Christ has many, many members with different vocations and responsibilities. So not all Christians are called to be politically outspoken, but obviously some Christians have that calling and they need prayer and support and affirmation from others.
But really, politics have invaded religion more than religion is shaping politics.
Well, yes, but it goes both ways. I mean, America is just so intrinsically religious from the start that even the most supposedly secular aspects of American culture are sort of descendants of some form of religiosity that sort of went astray. So it's very hard in America to completely separate the secular from the religious, I think.
Mark, we have time for 2 more questions, and we're booked already, so here we go.
Mark, as a rationale for all this nonsense, you hear the word broadening oftentimes mentioned, but when you look at the attendance number, the membership numbers, you see flattening, you see shrinkage, broadening not so much. Where do you see these people going? Are they leaving mainline Protestantism for other Protestant churches? Are they moving toward the Roman Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church? Are they leaving Christianity altogether?
Well, as mentioned, arguably the number of people who actively go to church has remained as a percentage about the same. But there has been much hoopla over the last couple of years over polls showing the number of so-called religious nuns, N-O-N-E-S, have risen, in some cases to 50%, in other cases to 20%, and supposedly that's evidence of a more secular America. I think it's more complicated than that, and that probably people who call themselves unaffiliated today, 30 years ago, may have said, oh, well, I'm Presbyterian because my grandparents were Presbyterian, but I don't go to church but maybe Christmas once every 2 years. I just think that people who, again, because we're in a post-denominational age, people who are not religiously practicing feel less and less attached to institutional religion, and that shows up in the numbers. Although, interestingly, even among the religious nuns, like 10 to 50% of them report being actively going to church regularly, and most of them believe in God and believe in prayer. So not even all of them are necessarily secular. They just don't identify with any denomination per se. In terms of what Americans say they are, as I mentioned, about 20% typically say they're some form of mainline Protestant, and that's just how they describe themselves. Obviously, they're not actually members, all 20%. And then maybe 30% would be, broadly speaking, some kind of evangelical, white to black, Hispanic. And then typically 25% say they're Catholic. So about 75% of Americans will say they're Christian, and maybe 15 or 20% will say they're one of the nuns. And then you have 5% who are all the others. 2% would be Jewish, and 1% or less would be Muslim, and the other 3% would be everything else.
Well, we had one question booked, but I'm going to step in the brink and ask one. Hank Hanegraaff always famously said, he probably wasn't the first person to say it, nor will he be the last, that all heresies ultimately have their root in the misconception of the nature of God. And listening to you talk last night about the mainline church, and listening to you talk tonight about the evangelical church, it seems to me that this influence, this we would call, most of us presumably here would call this perverse influence of liberality, which has come into the churches, is really a function of a misunderstanding, a love affair with the utopia here on earth. That not that we as the church should be full of mercy and grace and charity and try to alleviate the suffering and the problems which are caused by humans' obviously fallen state and their failed attempts to form a just government, but that somehow we can change that and we can make this work. Is that a reasonable assessment? Is that something that the church should be thinking about as they try to assess their role in as far as their relationship to society is concerned?
Yes, that's a wonderful analogy that often those who are outside of faith or have lost faith still have, let's say they're going to become a complete nihilist, they still have this drive to apply their energies to something constructive and want to build a better society, even though they can't really explain morally or spiritually why they want to have that better society. But nonetheless, they're driven in that direction, which can be positive if they want to help the poor and have better schools, and that's wonderful. They can be partners with us, but very often divorced completely from faith, it becomes utopian and messianic, and ultimately in its very extremes, totalitarian. So.
Well, thank you.
All right, thank you.
We appreciate it.